This video is sponsored by Graft. Oh yeah, nice hat, Ludo. FF9 is fantastic, isn't it? I've never been more in love with the game and its characters, but also miffed at how it was technically put together, which brought to light past problems with the JRPG genre as a whole with regards to how it manages parties. I'm sure all of this is going to be received with grace and decorum. And when I say technically put together, I don't mean visually. This was the final PS1 release for the series, and I can't find a game that utilizes its underpowered hardware through pre-rendered techniques more efficiently than Final Fantasy IX. They've really mastered the illusion of compositing its characters into these environments that have so much depth to them. That, along with each battle arena being a uniquely modeled version of the overworld setting that the enemies were encountered in, and all of its characters having custom animations to better convey their characters' emotions during gameplay, which used to just be delegated to cutscenes only. All of this extra attention to detail is an insane amount of added work, and it did not go unnoticed. But speaking of characters, this might be the first ever JRPG I've played where I actually like nearly every single playable character that they introduce. Their motivations, flaws, and relationships actually make sense, and this is mostly due to the game constantly cycling them in and out to better tell their stories, manufacturing ways to separate them and create unique character interactions and gameplay challenges. Because unlike 7 and 8, Final Fantasy IX returns the franchise to the beloved job class system, where each character would fill a specific role, but where in FF5 players could acquire and switch jobs between party members on the fly to better fit their personal playstyles, in 9, each character is affixed to a specific job that cannot be altered. Now narratively, this is really powerful as it allows for more unique character development. For example, the fact that Vivi is a black mage is integral to their entire story, and this goes for all of the core cast, aiding in the delivery of the game's story as a whole. But this, in combination with it constantly cycling its characters out, reveals a mechanical problem. Now, there are mechanical benefits to splitting the party like this. It can give the players time to comfortably level characters separately but uniformly, whilst also exploring their individual motivations, like splitting Steiner and Garlic-Meister into their own smaller party to develop their relationship. No, Garlic-Meister is a canon name and I will die on this hill! But these times apart can also create extended periods of heightened difficulty and resource drain specifically because of this job system. Because one of the core jobs that is instantaneously recognizable is White Mage, the healer, but for large sections of the first half of the game, no White Mage is available to play, leaving the rest of the team without a reliable way to heal or remove status effects, forcing them to resort to using potions, elixirs, or the myriad of status cure items. But because these party split moments happen spontaneously in the story to keep it fresh, the player has very little time to actually plan for this. Sometimes they'll be immediately thrown into a dungeon where they'll have to spend 10 to 20 potions after every single combat encounter just to have a fighting chance of reaching the other side of it. This all combined with the unbelievably high encounter rate in Final Fantasy IX can have a drastic drain on not only your items, but the gil needed to restock your supplies just in case this happens again. But in stark contrast, having a White Mage in your party makes most combat encounters a breeze. Being able to spam heals in AoE makes the peaks and valleys of difficulty kinda nutty. But splitting the party constantly in the first half of the game isn't exactly a deal breaker, but it can have drastic and unforeseen effects on late game balance if the player is following the story linearly. So in our previous episodes on FF7 and 8, we've spoken at length about how their step count based encounter system regulates the number of random encounters the player endures over any given time to carefully manage EXP and maintain certain levels of difficulty as they progress. But this also happens with gil. It's moolah, mate, cash. It's equally as important as experience, especially in Final Fantasy IX, because spending gil at designated shops is the primary way players gain new gear, which is the only way to learn new useful passives and spells, because while certain gear is equipped, it gives access to unique abilities associated with that gear specifically. After completing enough combat encounters with this gear equipped, you can eventually unlock these abilities permanently. Although some of these items can be found in chests while exploring, the majority of them are tucked away in little shops spread out throughout the world. For example, Vivi's staff that unlocks all of the G variants of his spells can only be purchased from this completely missable shop located in the corner of the map. So because of this, gil, money, is super important to attaining power. But due to the job system, most weapons and gear can only be equipped by specific characters, and even if someone else can equip it, they might not be able to use the passives they grant. And because skill is carefully managed, just like XP to maintain difficulty, the player only has so much money to spend on their shopping sprees, so obviously they're encouraged to purchase gear that will directly benefit their present party members, as they're the ones who can utilize and level those abilities as they fight. Now, the first half of the game is immaculately built to carefully drip feed items and EXP to your party pretty equally, so this isn't much of a big deal, but the problem rears its ugly head as soon as the game begins to give the player any semblance of choice. But before we get into that, guys, I need to go farm some abilities that I got off these socks I just found, so while I'm doing that, why not take a look at this new game Graft that I've been hearing about.
This video is brought to you by Graft, a story-driven survival horror RPG from the makers of the Shadowrun trilogy. Wishlist now on Steam.
Hey, remember how we met? You were sitting there on your bike and you just had to talk to me. You said seeing me, you felt a shock. And I said, no, not again, wake up. Come on, stay with me. There we go. Yeah, it's me. You're safe. I mean, not safe, but... No. You promised you could handle these changes. Listen to me, you have to slow down. You're slipping away. I don't even know who you are anymore. You don't know who you are. Maybe I don't even know what you are. Just please, stay with me.
Welcome back, mate, to the second half of this episode where we're going to discuss the second half of FF9, our Finn. So at the beginning of Disc 3, the game opens up, granting access to more of its world and allowing players to pick from the full roster of its 8 playable characters. But as we've previously discussed, the game's ability upgrade system encourages players to initially form a party consisting of characters they've already spent the most time with due to their higher level, already bought gear and associated passives that they've gained, leaving its remaining cast to gather dust. Now, Zidane as the main character is the one mandatory party member, and as previously mentioned, you'd be stupid to not take one of the 2 white mages, and Garlic has been the narrative focus from the beginning, so in reality, you have 2 slots to fill, but certain characters have mechanical interactions between them encouraging specific party setups. Vivi, for example, buffs Steiner and gives him a completely new spell-based moveset that he wouldn't otherwise have if they're in the party together. Zidane, Garlic, Vivi, and Steiner are also the 4 characters who have had the most screen time out of the entire roster, so their levels, items acquired, and passives will be the highest. As a result, the odds of the player being invested in these characters both narratively and mechanically is super high, so this is going to be most new players' core party setup. Now, it is nice that players are allowed to choose, but for all its benefits, I think this actively harms the game in more ways than one. Because the game can never account for which characters are actively being used by the player, the meaningful interactions your party contributes to the story begin to dwindle after Disc 2. Dialogue defaults to simple grunts or ... in places where characters speaking up would feel relevant as a catch-all for whatever characters they may have chosen. This is why the latter half of the game becomes this Zidane fest, whereas the first half is pretty equally split between its many wonderful characters. The only way they can have meaningful narrative moments with the full cast is if the game forces them to happen, which is great for the story. The first half of the game is nothing but this and is paced beautifully, but this can be a mechanical headshot to the player's motivation to continue if dragged to its extremes in combination with the game's progression systems, which unfortunately happened to me personally. When the game hinted at 4 different locations on the map, citing the need to split the party 4 ways, I got these horrific FF6 Kefka's Tower PTSD. Oh, basically, the final dungeon required the player to split the cast into 3 distinct teams to tackle 3 separate dungeon sections simultaneously, which meant the player needed to level every single character up to give them a chance of reaching the game's climax. And if you weren't anticipating this, it could take hours upon hours of farming, and this was gross to say the least. But fortunately here, the forced party split is done strictly for narrative reasons, and mechanically, only Zidane, who is guaranteed to be your most leveled character, and Quina need to actively fight. The same goes for the very ending of the game. Going into the final encounter, the game lets you pick 4 characters to fight, and the others give up their power to help the rest of the team. This lets you play the way you see fit, whilst also giving narrative context for all 8 characters. This is beautiful, which makes this one earlier moment that occurred even more egregious. Directly after this strictly narrative-based party split, there is a point of no return where the gang travels to the alternate planet Terra for the very first time, and the narrative revelations here, which are directly tied to Zidane for reasons we previously mentioned, take over an hour to unfold. And these story beats are so enthralling that while I was greedily eating them all up, I didn't manage to find the provided save point in this area. Oh yeah, I think I can be forgiven for not seeing it, as it's actively hidden in a pot, mate. Anyway, throughout this hour of dialogue and cutscenes, I follow Zidane through his identity crisis, culminating with him being thrown into a boss gauntlet of impossible odds to tackle by himself. But in typical anime fashion, all of his mates come together one by one to aid him, which is super cheesy, but a lovely narrative moment. However, unlike the previously mentioned party split, this is mechanical, as they're trying to help you in combat. And I'm sure some of you saw this coming, but the characters who came in first to aid me were underleveled and got one shot back to back, completely resetting me to before I even stepped foot onto the planet and costing me over an hour of progress. And the answer to overcome this? Go mindlessly farm for multiple hours to get my secondary characters to a similar level, and then sit through the hours worth of dialogue again, which just completely undermined the narrative revelations that occurred here and put a complete stopper in my motivation to continue. And yes, a lot of this could have been mitigated by having better save point placement in Terra specifically, but the central question here is what the game expects from its players in terms of farming and how it communicates this to them. Because from my perspective, it doesn't. Nothing up until this point educates the player on 8 character party splitting being a mechanical necessity for them to manage themselves. If anything, the first 2 discs, the party split directly before this moment and the ending, convey the very opposite, which is why I, and I'm sure many other players, were completely blindsided by this. Well, no, the answer isn't just, well, the player should have just expected this because it's a JRPG and should have taken the time away from progressing the story to farm for a completely different party just in case this happens. You cannot, from a design perspective, craft mechanics around assumed knowledge of a genre. It doesn't matter that this is the 9th installment of the series. These games are all individual experiments anyway. As a designer, you have to assume that this is the first time the player has ever engaged with the genre and teach them the expected play behavior as they progress. Because, wait, you're completely right, person who's writing that comment as we speak. This isn't a problem if you expected it. If you know a thing and you plan for it, the thing isn't a problem. Things are never problems, till they are, but that's not accounting for the spectrum of different types of players who are engaging with this product. If you enjoy farming, more power to you, but if a player is just simply following along with a story, hitting a roadblock requires them to stop engaging with it and forces them to do what is the video game equivalent of manual labor is kind of nuts, and I think it's a bit odd that some JRPG fans defend it like it's a required aspect to actually enjoy the games. This would be an unfathomable blunder in any other genre. It would be like if you got to the final mission in an FPS and it forced you to grind out 500 headshots before it would let you inside, or a racing game not letting you compete in the final cup that you've done 100 laps around the beginner course. But JRPGs silently expect players to grind just so they can simply experience the core story, and this is just the norm, or should I say, was the norm. Because this might be an age thing. Modern JRPGs have somewhat moved away from having a large cast of switchable characters that players are expected to level equally, and my assumption is that this was done to avoid problems like this. For example, Bravely Default, Expedition 33 and Sea of Stars allows their smaller cast to have more direct involvement with their stories and don't blindside players with forced party swaps or level requirements. Yes, there are games that have a lot of characters like Octopath Traveler, but this series takes extra care to split its narratives in ways that encourages character leveling between chapters and is strictly designed around having this large cast. And even at the extreme end of this spectrum with Pokemon, a series famous for adhering to design trends that the industry has moved on from decades ago, has realized in modern iterations that farming levels for alternate characters is the least interesting part about progression, hence why they introduced EXP sharing. Farming should be an avenue to pursue extra challenge, not a requirement to tackle the main story, because I absolutely enjoyed Final Fantasy IX. It is by far my favourite story of the entire series so far, but this one misstep in Terra is a dark-stained brick wall on what was otherwise an incredibly smooth and well-paced experience. I'm just glad that the industry has largely moved on from these kind of requirements. But what do you think? Is this something players should be expected to plan for, or was this just a mechanical oversight from the developers while trying to have a meaningful moment between characters at the 11th hour? Let us know down below, because we would love to discuss this with you. And what do you think should be the next retro Jay's never played it before design delve? Come vote on the next game I tackle over on my personal Twitch channel tomorrow at 7 PM EST. I look forward to seeing you there. Alright, it's time to say goodbye, Ludo. Alright. Bye, guys.